too. So thank you all for coming and joining us. Thank you, everybody who's coming today as a guest. This is a very special conversation for me. I love talking about culture and food being a portal to culture. And I think that when we talk about terroir, I'm always on about, yes, there's an environmental aspect to it, but there's very much a human aspect to it. And that human aspect takes many shapes and forms, including the environment, geography, politics, and religion plays a big role in that. And we've hosted other conversations where we sort of delve into the ideas of how food and religion are intertwined, but also how they're not just monogamous to their own specific sect of religion. So they can have interconnected relationships from other religions as well. And that's very true of Islam and Ramadan as well. So I'm hoping that we're going to find a little bit about that and what the rituals are. A little bit of the meaning about fast, because that's also intriguing and predates any religion. Humans have fasted as sort of part of a dietary ritual since we've been, collective societies. And we definitely did it in pagan times, and we're still doing it today in these, in these non-secular groups as well. And so I want to welcome our first guest, who's spoken at many terroirs, and I really admire her. Anissa Halou, who's a chef, a food writer, a journalist, broadcaster, and a consultant. She also wrote a book called Feast, which is a celebration of Islamic food across the world. So it covers North Africa to Southeast Asia. But she also wrote one of my favorite books, The Levant, which I'm hoping she's going to focus on for today's conversation, which is, of course, that chunk of the Middle East that spans from Turkey down to Jordan. And so thank you, Anissa, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
And so we're going to start with a general question I'm going to ask each of you. And if you can just, introduce yourself through this question, which is, how Ramadan and traditional foods of Islam, how are they represented in the Middle East and for you, the Levant? And how as an expatriate do you carry on these traditions, and how important is that for you?
To start with, I'm not Muslim. So Ramadan means a lot to me, but not as a religion, because it's not my religion. But Ramadan is a very special month for all Muslims, because it's a kind of month of contrast. During the day, you're completely you fast, you don't drink, you don't do anything. And as soon as the sun sets, it becomes a very festive atmosphere with families gathering, friends, etc., lots of food. Christian Lent is about deprivation, whereas Muslim Ramadan is about purification. It's a completely different concept. You're not punishing yourself, but you're kind of elevating yourself to be nearer to God and to be a better person. I mean, it's the same for Lent. And for me, as a Lebanese Syrian, the most important part of Ramadan is the sweets, because it's the month where there are like 10 times as many sweets made in homes and sweet makers and whatever. And as I have a very sweet tooth, I just love the idea of, spending the whole month trying, the different sweets and the special, the ones that are specially made for the month or whatever. And of course, it's a great experience to kind of go into restaurants where people are sitting very silently and very serenely, even if they're dying of hunger, waiting for the muezzin to announce, the breaking of the fast, and then very slowly break into eating again, which is quite a magical sort of moment.
I want to pick up on something you said, because I think it's a very important point to note, which is that even though you're not Muslim, you come from a Muslim background, and these traditions that we have inherently become more cultural than they are religious. I mean, I come from a Christian background. I'm an atheist, but I still follow, Christmas and Easter. I still follow those rituals because they're embedded in the fabric of our society, but also my family. And for more than anything, it's a time to get together.
Exactly. And it's a special time because, the rituals are different. And foods are different, and the way people get together is special. So they're very meaningful. Very meaningful. All these Ramadan, Easter, Christmas, Lent are all very meaningful times. I'm an atheist like you, but even then, I look forward to them.
They're special. They create special moments, and trigger points where we can actually like mark things. I also want to talk a little bit about the lunar calendar, but I'm going to move over to Senya Hotek, who is a friend and Terroir participant for many years. She's a photographer and a food stylist. She's currently in the process of writing a book with a colleague in Canada with a Syrian community. Is that correct, Senya?
That is all correct.
Okay, good. Senya's from Bosnia originally, and I think it's super interesting because Bosnia is not a place that one considers to have a Muslim tradition, but of course it has a long-standing Muslim past because of the occupation of the Ottomans. And so I want to ask you the same question. How is Ramadan and traditional food of Islam represented for you from your Balkan and Bosnian heritage? And how do you carry those traditions on as an expat? And I know that you're not very religious either, so...
Interesting. It is interesting. It's very dear to us. So I come from Bosnia, and Bosnia predominantly has been Muslim, for 400 or 500 years. It's sort of the bridge from the, Middle East, or the East, as we like to say, to the West. So we grew up in a socialist state. So Yugoslavia, 7 countries. Bosnia was the Muslim sort of population concentration. So Ramadan was always celebrated just like the other Catholic or Christian holidays were. So it was a very kind of collective gathering. Of course, it's, the traditions are very similar to many other ones. So, you fast, and there is this sense, like Anissa said, of purification and appreciation. And I think, your levels of patience and understanding and value for food that's around is really elevated. And I think in that sense, for me, what it means, it's sort of a spiritual elevation in a sense. And also you get to really appreciate, what we sort of have around. So a lot of people, older people who have been fasting, mostly, my grandparents and parents, unless they're on medication, everyone fasts as a way to purify their health. So it's seen as more than just a religious practice per se. I think a lot of people look forward to it to cleanse their bodies, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I want to pick up on something you said, which is about these sort of combined communities. And I think that one of the things that we forget is that people didn't live in isolation of each other. And in fact, for many thousands of years, religions lived side by side, sometimes in conflict, but often in peace. And so in those peaceful moments, they did actually share each other's rituals and traditions. And so they kind of do sometimes overlap. So I think that's a very important point to make.
Very much so. I mean, you have to imagine Bosnia, having Christian, Orthodox, Catholic, Roman Catholic, and Muslims, and also, a small population of Jews. So it's interesting. And before the war, it was a very multicultural place. Bosnia more so. That's where you have most kind of, mixed marriages and so on and so forth. And our diaspora, it's about 1 million, right? So, these are carrying on. And also we have to, I can't negate and not talk about the Civil War, the genocide that happened in Bosnia, which is why I'm in Canada. I'm a refugee. I'm not just somebody who chose to leave. So for me, celebrating Ramadan or acknowledging Ramadan or making a meal with my mom or anyone else, or making Iftar for my friends who are fasting, or telling my friends about why I fast once in a blue moon. I can't do it every day. But, it's an identity. It's kind of like a cultural preservation for my people. I can say that because, we're busy as is in the Western world. So when Ramadan comes around, we gather more and we talk more about things. And through the food, we revisit that identity. I mean, that's sort of what I feel that's most important.
Well, and especially as a refugee community, it's one of the things that you hang on to as a way of connecting back to home.
Yes, very much so.
So last, we have Amira Yasmin. She actually, as I mentioned earlier, if you weren't on the call, is a friend of my daughter's who they went to school together. It was important for me to understand and invite people from a wide spectrum of Muslim countries. And so we didn't get the full spectrum, but we got a pretty good one. Amira is from Indonesia, and I'm excited to hear her talk about, her experience. And she's been living in Berlin for 5 years now. And so what it's like for her to connect to her Muslim traditions and specifically around Ramadan.
Yeah, like because especially like what Ksenia said before, also with Bosnia, I think Indonesia has the resemblance with it being with it having the most Muslim population in the world, but at the same time not being a Muslim country. So there is a lot of, I think it's also about peace and purification. At the same time, for me, it's also about festivals and celebration, meeting friends, meeting family. Like around Ramadan, we would always go to like visit our families from somewhere else. Like there's always people would drive around, and I think it's a big festive feeling. It's about also purification, celebration, and so Ramadan is a big tradition, I think, in Indonesia as well. Even other people who don't celebrate Ramadan, I think it's also part of the culture. Hearing people walking around with the food. I was talking with my friend the other day, and we were talking about how now it's so different in Berlin, whereas she's not a Muslim, and she's like, how in Indonesia, even though you don't celebrate it, it's part of your daily life. It's part of the culture.
Mm.
You experience this food, this festival, and now that you're here, it's so different, even though she doesn't celebrate it. So I think it's bigger than just religion, also just culture and celebration and festival.
Well, which picks up on my thing that I was mentioning to Senya, which is, and Anissa, that, you know, it's embedded in the culture and the fabric of society. And I actually did an event with Will Goldfarb years ago, and he was coming to Berlin from Indonesia, and I called him to set up an appointment to talk about some stuff we needed to do. And he's like, I can't talk right now. It's Ramadan, and we're the biggest Muslim country, and everybody's off, and nobody's doing anything, and it's chaos. And I'm like, oh, I had no idea. So it was a big eye-opening exercise for myself. Do you celebrate Ramadan? Do you actually try to hold? You do. And so you fast?
Yes.
Okay. So, you know, what is it like? Tell us about, for those non-Muslim people joining us today, like, so we can really inherently understand, what is the ritual of Ramadan?
So with Ramadan, you would have this Suhoor thing, which you do, so you eat before sunrise. It's usually around 3 or 4. It also depends on the time where you are in the world, because it's about sunset and sunrise at the same time. And so you have Suhoor, where you eat before that, and then you start fasting until sunset. This is where it gets different, because in Indonesia, you would usually break fast at 6, because that's usually when the sunset is. But then in Berlin, it of course depends on like if it's in summer or if it's in winter. It always changes. And then after the break fasting, you can eat until Iftar again. And that's like the whole process of the month, pretty much.
Well, and even though you're fasting, which people associate with starving or not eating, I actually read a great author who said you can actually gain weight during Ramadan, because you actually, for the Iftar, have these massive feasts.
Mm-hmm.
I have never heard that, but I can now definitely see that happening. Especially in Indonesia, because you break fast at 6, you have a lot of time left where you can, like, we would always hang out with friends and family. You would always go to restaurants before Corona, and we would go to restaurants, and then we would still have time to hang out and do stuff, and then you can definitely eat the whole night. Whereas if it's in like Germany, where in summer we would like break fasting was about like 8 p.m. or something. There wasn't much time left to do everything. Would already be close by then. And so I can definitely see that happening.
Just a reminder to our participants, if you want to just keep checking the stage, we've got a lot of comments coming in. I'm going to try to get to you guys. I've got some questions for these guys first, but please, if you can, answer them. Anissa, would you be able to tell us a little bit about the Muslim calendar? And so Ramadan is the ninth month of the Islamic calendar, but of course it happens in a different time of our Gregorian calendar every year. This year it follows the moon cycles, but do you want to explain that a little bit?
Well, it goes every year. It goes back by about 10 days, because the Muslim calendar is a lunar calendar, and Ramadan starts on the sighting of the new moon of the 9th month. And the 9th month is the only month mentioned in the Quran, because it's when the Prophet Mohammed, received the book of God, and so it can be in the summer, it can be in the winter, it can be any time. So when we had the London Olympics in 2012, I was actually overseeing the catering in Qatar House, and it was in August, and they were breaking the fast at 9. In fact, during the month, it went back, like few minutes every day because the days shortened. And so at the beginning, they were breaking the fast at 9 p.m. or even later, which makes it a very long day for fasting without drinking. I mean, not eating is kind of okay, but not drinking for all these hours is very, very hard. So now it started on the 12th of April, and it will finish, I think, the 12th of May. And then there is the 3 days of Eid al-Fitr, which is the breaking of the fast. And then I think 2 months later, there's Eid al-Adha. Amira and Zenya, correct me if I get it wrong. So it's the most important time of the year for the Muslim population, for Muslims all over the world.
And do you fast?
Me?
Have you ever?
No. No, even when I was in the Gulf during Ramadan, because at one stage I wrote an article for Suhoor, and we went to the Emirates in August. It was in August, and it was so hot. And I mean, I tried to fast one day just to kind of get a feeling of what it's like, but I couldn't resist.
I tried to fast once doing one of these cleanses, and I lasted until lunch.
It takes about 3 days, I feel like, for the body to, I mean, people also have to remember you're kind of cutting your body off from liquid. So if you're a coffee drinker, the toughest thing for me was always the coffee headache, right?
So you fasted, Senya?
I fasted before, definitely. I've never fasted for the whole month. I'm such a busy bee that I get faint, and I just like to get going. But all my grandparents always did, my parents, like if somebody's sick in the family, you also fast. Like there's a spiritual kind of sacred meaning to fasting. And, when you do break your fast and whoever brings you that water in those first dates, you just have this vibrancy of love towards this person. It's a very elevating, it's really a special feeling, I have to say. I know it's difficult, but when you do get into, away from the headaches, and your joy and your appreciation for whoever you're breaking your fast with is just, you feel more love.
Well, I want to pick up on the date piece because in a lot of our social media stuff that we were posting, of course, the dates are an important part of this ritual. And it's a very important part of the Muslim diet, period. And I want to talk a little bit about where they came from and what they mean. So when I was doing my research, I understood that Mohammed is said to have eaten 3 dates a day to break the fast during Ramadan. And that he also said that people in a house without dates are in a state of hunger, and that people are protected from poison and witchcraft. Of course, before Islam and before the Abrahamic religions, the earlier religions of that space, which is now the Levant, also called the date tree the tree of life. And so I realized or read that it's a superfood and can provide a day's worth of nutrition. One of the things that people also don't realize, and I think, Anissa, we talked about this at one point, but that, the early tribes of that peninsula would go from oasis to oasis. And each of these oases, they would have these palm trees that provided, of course, these rich dates. But second to that, that they were also able to trade and spread their religion as a result of that. And dates were an important component of that. So how important are dates for you, Senya, and how were they in the Balkans?
Well, dates are kind of the thing that you would gift very often. It's certainly not something that grows in our region. So, but again, Bosnia was unique in the sense that, yes, the Ottomans came through and left a lot, but we had a lot of kind of trade routes and agreements with many African countries. So Tito, our communist leader, he kind of had a pact with India, Cuba, and 18 countries in Africa, and most people don't know that. So we kind of kept, kind of trading a lot. A lot of our architects went to Africa, and a lot of, food and culture and, music and choirs came through. So there was always this trade. So we always had access to these things. But when the war began, for example, right, like everything's cut off because it's just not local. So we were kind of codependent on a lot of these people to maintain being Muslim, whatever that meant, you know, in Bosnia. It's a tricky topic. So.
And Anissa, I'm interested from you because, of course, these early sweets that people were eating in the Middle East, of course, they had dates in them. Did they have sugar, or were dates their sole sort of resource for sugar as well?
I think they had sugar. Well, it would have been honey more than dates.
Okay.
The first sweetener, let's say, but they had sugar quite early on. To be honest, I don't remember because I have such a bad memory.
Yeah. Okay, so but another question would be like, why this, you know, obsession with sweet? Because we know, I just actually went for our photo shoot that we were doing for our other project to get some baklava in Berlin, and it was the first day of Ramadan. And of course, like there was nobody, and then there was everybody because they were getting sweets for their evening iftar. But sweets are really, really compelling.
It's to do with hospitality. It's Arab people or have a very sweet tooth anyway, and sweets is a very important part of their life, basically, more than diet, because they don't eat sweets at the end of a dessert, at the end of a meal. They eat sweets in between and when they're receiving. And as hospitality is very important, whenever they offer coffee or tea or a juice or soft drink or whatever, there's always a tray of sweets, maybe also savory stuff, but sweets are like ever present. And during Ramadan, it's also, I think, it's a kind of energizing thing because, you know, you lose a lot of energy during the day's fast. And if I'm not mistaken, in Indonesia, they break the fast with these sweet coconut milk drinks with all the jellied stuff inside. And, you know, the dates are sweet. And then, you know, throughout the night, when you spend with family and friends and everything, the sweets are like there to offer and to nibble on and to enjoy.
Amir, is it the same for you in Indonesia?
Yeah, I think with the sweets, I think it also has something, as Anissa said, with the fasting the whole day. It's also you're low on like sugar intake, and I think it's also because now to be more energetic, it's with the sugar, but it's also correct with this coconut milk to drink, kind of like a dessert thing. But you do that, you eat it after you break fasting. Everything is sweet there, but the dates I think are a bit more different than in the Middle East, because in Indonesia we only have dates, or I only encounter dates when I was little, when it's Ramadan. Everywhere you would find it everywhere. It was dates, even the decorations in the malls and everything, they're dates. But other than Ramadan, you barely really find them around that much. I think you have to find them like really somewhere special, but it's not as available as they are in Ramadan. So dates are very like Ramadan themed. You find it everywhere in the supermarkets, everywhere. But other than Ramadan, it's a bit different in Indonesia.
Well, let's talk about typical foods from each of your countries that represent sort of the Suhoor and the Iftar. Like, are there ritual foods that you eat during Ramadan for those meals that you wouldn't eat other times that are special to that, Amira?
For me, I think the food that Anissa mentioned, this coconut milk they're usually with banana, pumpkin, and also sweet potatoes inside. And it's just this very sweet thing. And you only have it, I only encounter it during Ramadan. I think people only sell them during Ramadan for some reason. And it's just a very Ramadan festive feeling for that one. And other than that, I think at the end of the month, this Eid al-Fitr, that one is very different food, I think, in other countries. In Indonesia, it's very like chicken curry and also this rice cakes that we would have, and beef rendang, if anyone know that. So I think the food are very different in Indonesia than in the Middle East, but there are definitely some food that you only have that just very Ramadan feeling at the end.
And what about you, Senya?
Very similar to Turkish cuisine, right? Because that was our impact. So of course it's regional, given our kind of access to certain things. So in the mornings you'll kind of eat kind of like breads and yogurt, but definitely sweets and the coffee as well. Like if you don't smell the coffee in the morning, you're not going to have a good day going forward. Coffee is like a big deal during everything. So if you can sneak it in at 4 a.m., you sneak it in at 4 a.m. So coffee and sweets are always definite. Depending on the region and whether you're rural, it's more in a rural area. So I remember my grandma, frying halva and me smelling that, very simple things. More so the simple things, I think, lots of dolmas. We have a thing that we still maintain at home to say that you must eat with a spoon once a day at least. We don't cut food much. You use your hands or you eat with a spoon. So there's that nourishment. So lots of soups, lots of yogurt, because, we also have to remember, there are reasons why we eat dates, the potassium intake, the fiber, all the healthy stuff. Same with yogurt, the probiotics. This is to maintain the body, to help digest and all these things. So, but sweets is definitely what Anissa was saying too. Like, if you better have your sweets around. And mom always has stuff stashed around the house. Like, you think you're done, and then somebody else arrives, and then there are 3 things that appear, and you're like, Mom, but it's a very common thing. It's endearing. I mean, I'm trying to do it myself. It's very sweet.
It's very sweet, no pun intended. No pun intended. Anissa, I left you for last because, of course, you wrote the book on this. I was flipping through it this week, and I came across Tarid. Is that how you say it? And I learned that it was Mohammed's favorite dish, and it was one of the things that he used to break the iftar. Some of the other readings I did, both through your book and in other sources, it seems that there's like lots of stews or curries. And so I'm curious, is there a connection between these foodstuffs, and did they travel? And then also, when are they cooking them? Because that tarid takes hours to cook. So can you cook?
It doesn't actually. I've just written, I wrote a piece for the LA Times, and I took tarid as the theme, but basically to explain that not only is it a particular dish to iftar in the Gulf, but it's a dish that has traveled across the Middle East in different variations. So you have fateh in the Levant, which is a variation of tarid. Trid in Morocco, which is a variation of tarid. Dizi in Iran, they're all bread-based dishes. And so bread is the sort of base, and either the bread is the base layer, and then you add stews, or like in tarid, it's a vegetable and meat stew, and the bread is soaked in the broth of the sauce of the stew. In fateh, it's completely different because the bread is toasted, and then you have the meat and chickpeas or vegetables, and then you have yogurt on top and toasted pine nuts. Trid, the Moroccan trid, is very interesting because you can see the women making the bread, which is a very, very, very thin layers that they bake over a sort of like a hat mold, an earthenware or a stone, kind of inverted jar that is over a fire. And then they flip that very thin disc of dough over it, and flip it, peel it off immediately, practically. And then they kind of just crunch it up and then do a tagine or some sort of stew on top with, and then there is another variation, but I can't remember now because I have such a bad memory.
Well, you also brought up in your book, though, that the curries of Indonesia are very similarly related to
this. Well, there is one curry that I think I had it in Ambon, where they made rotis, and they used roti as the base, and then they put that curry, which was a nut-based sauce instead of a coconut milk-based sauce. It was absolutely delicious, but she never gave me a proper recipe. So
you'll have to get that one day. Tell us a little bit about this idea of eating with your hand. And I don't know if it's, from what I've understood, and Senya, I think you and I talked about it, it's this sensuality of like being connected to your food. Can you describe that a little bit?
Me or Xenia?
No, you, Anissa.
Well, eating with your hands is very much, I think it's very much part of most of the Muslim world. But it depends on the country. Like in Lebanon or in the Levant, you use bread to scoop the food. You don't actually use your hands directly. So there is bread as the barrier between your fingers and the food. Whereas in the Gulf, you use your fingers to pick up rice, and there is a technique not to get it not to be very messy. And also, you never use your left hand. You use your right hand, and that's to do with hygiene. And you wash your hands before and you wash your hands immediately after. So most of the houses in the Gulf, for instance, have a bathroom very near the drawing room so that the guests will get up and then go and wash their hands. I mean, before and after. And so I don't know if it's the sensuality or a tradition when they didn't have cutlery and it stays, or just the pleasure of picking. I mean, I love eating with my hands. I don't know. I'm not very good at picking up rice with my hands, even though I remember it.
Well, Senya, you had thoughts on this too, because we had this conversation.
Oh, I love eating with my hands, and it's when you said about the bread. So there's a special bread, it kind of originated in Sarajevo, just because that's where all the kind of, that's where all the trades were happening, and it was the capital. But somun, which is like it's a type of flatbread. It's baked in a stone oven, and you put black cumin seeds on top. So during Ramadan, there are lineups everywhere, right? And all you smell is, just the somun. So that's what you would use to pick up the food with. But also, we eat a lot of burek and pita, which is like you have to stretch the dough, which is called yufka, and you roll it. And of course, we sometimes use cabbage because there's lots of cabbage. In Bosnia. In some other countries, it's, burek, which is just with meat, or you can do it with potatoes. So, a lot of our food is kind of made to be shared. So also when we sit down, my father, always kind of would build all the women in the house. It's a round table. So you sit on the floor, you cross your legs, you have your cushion. There's something called the Bosnian kitchen, which is essentially very kind of inviting and warm. So you're around a table. And I remember in my grandma's house, it was like a round container, and you sit as kids. Of course, you have to wash your hands. We also had, just separate hand washing kind of stations just outside the house. And then on the other side, sometimes it was, a lower one, so you can wash your feet when you're doing your abdes, which is like you're getting ready to pray, right? So all these things were quite ergonomic, done with a lot of caress and mindfulness, even at that time. And it was especially for that. And there was, a beautiful kind of set of dishes around there, or, nice towels and so on and so forth. So eating with your hands, I feel like in Bosnia, maybe because I'm kind of an old Bosnian soul, I like to preserve it. It gives me pleasure.
Well, I just want to mention that Nazmi Kamal, who's a good friend of Terroir's, we've done work with him before, he says eating with the hands makes a personal connection, intimacy with food and its value. I think that's very true and very lovely. You mentioned, Senya, this idea of eating around a round table, which is another thing that I discovered. And what I understand about this is that all the food is meant to be put in the center of the table. Everybody's meant to share and serve themselves. And this is about creating a system of equality and also diversity, so there's no hierarchy. Is that still, you obviously follow that ritual, Amir? Is that a ritual that you would follow in Indonesia?
It's not that something that I'm actually aware of before. So with at least my family, it was just that we have food spread everywhere, and then we would just take it anytime we want, and then we'd go somewhere and eat with and talk with like a member of the family. But eating in the middle and sense of hierarchy and those kind of things wasn't something that I was aware of before. So, but I don't know if it's something that people do in Indonesia, but I've never actually heard that in Indonesia of it being a thing.
Coming from a WASP family where I was used to being served a singular plate of food and nobody touched anybody else's. In fact, I didn't want my food on my plate to touch itself. This idea of a melange of food that you just serve. But now, of course, I've grown to love it. We've talked a lot about the food. Let's talk a little bit about the fasting rituals. Another friend of ours, Sabanur, in the talk says, in Turkey, we have drummers waking people up for Suhoor. Are there these rituals, Anissa, that follow the celebration that aren't about food, that are about the fasting parts and sort of the...
Yeah, I mean, the drummer is wonderful, because when I lived in Beirut, where I grew up, we had, the drummer was called tabal, which means drummer. And he would go around at 4 or 5 in the morning, depending on, just before sunrise, drumming to wake up the people to have their suhoor, so that they don't get very hungry during the fasting day. And then, of course, the sound of the muezzin at sunset, when the sun sets, calling to prayer and best for people to break their fast. It was in Cairo that I had the best experience near the, I think, Al-Azhar Mosque. There's this big piazza, and all the restaurants, cafe restaurants, had laid tables, and they have the little dishes, the first little dishes, to break the fast. And everybody sits, like 10 minutes, 15 minutes before, waiting. Even the kids were very well behaved. Nobody rushed to the food as soon as the muezzin announced the setting of the sun. And then next to there were the poor people's tables. They're called the table of mercy, I think, Ma'adat al-Rahman, where corporations or neighbors or rich people provide the food for those homeless or poor people. And then they lay the initial dishes, and then the volunteers bring the iftar meal. It's it's a pre-eating ritual, which is quite wonderful.
And then what about the idea of that fasting period, which could be, of course, depending in Indonesia, it's probably 12 hours on the nose. In Berlin, it could be 18. That time is about reverence. It's about self-discipline. Like, what does it mean to you, Amira? What does it mean to you? Because you are actually fasting. Outside of just of giving up food, what is the spiritual relevance?
I think for me, it's also about patience and not being greedy and being able to hold myself back. I think it's a practice for me in my daily life as well. So I can not just be as greedy as I would probably be usually, just being less mindful of things. So I feel like being fasting also helps me keep myself and start to think I can hold myself back, and patience and that kind of sense. At the same time, I think it's about understanding. I think being able to understand and see in a different perspective of what other people are through in some part of the world, or like just other people, not being able to eat in that sense. And I think it's also about sympathy as well as health, because it's also a big thing with the health, as you said before. Fasting is pre-Muslim thing, pre-Islam thing that people have done that. It's all on their dietary, and I think it's also about health as well as sympathy and religion at the same time.
Senya, when we spoke earlier, you mentioned something about charity, which I've understood is a big component of Ramadan as well. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I could just massage out what Amira said. Essentially, you kind of have this collective understanding of what it's like to be hungry, right? Like, that's a very humanizing feeling. And I felt it during Ramadan. I felt it in other ways during the war. And so once you're hungry, and then you have food versus you don't have food, you really become a collective human. You become human first. And a lot of people don't take that away just because we have access to things. Not everybody does. So, we also have these tables, or you invite other families to home, or you butcher a lamb, which was done very often, more so for the other Eid, but also here. Back in the day, you would, kind of do a freezer order of this animal, and you would bring it to other families who you just knew, with a lot of respect, you would bring it to their home. Sometimes incognito. Donations are done. There's a lot of prayer. So charity, they say it enhances your connection to the greater good when you do these things during Ramadan a lot more. And it's a beautiful practice. I mean, I think Islam is painted in many ways sometimes as, a religion that's not so kind, but truthfully, the basics of it are extremely kind, and they are about others. And women are not from how I was taught to be, kind of put in the back and submissive. So, the sacred practice of just being able to feel things through lack of food, it does something to you. And also, a few years ago, I went through a period of some health issues, and I decided to do some fasting, intermittent fasting, right? So it changes you. It makes you healthier. There's a reason why most religions fast at certain times of the year, I think there's a lot of benefit to it. Whether you people want to look at ketogenic fasting or fasting and call it a Muslim thing or a Buddhist thing or whatever you want to, just it works for everybody.
The Muslims can bring keto back, or the other way around. Christine Brun in our chat says here, I think this is lovely. In Palestine, if you slaughter a lamb at the Eid, you keep a third, you give a third to your family and a third to the less fortunate, which I think is a charity that, we often, in more Western societies, we have food banks, but really it doesn't operate in the same way that you have this personal connection. Nazmi also wonders about the relationship between fasting across religions. Of course, we just came out of Easter and Lent, which also happens around 40 days. Anissa, do you know if there's any connection between those two things? I mean, fundamentally, they're both Abrahamic religions. Like, do you think it's a pagan thing that's been carried?
No, Ramadan comes from the Jewish tradition, which is called Ashura, actually, which was a 10 days fast. And then they developed it into a whole month. But initially, it is Abrahamic. But it would have come from pagan, before that.
Yeah.
But Lent is to do with Christ being in the desert, but it must be connected. I mean, this whole fasting ritual. Lent is different because you don't actually fast. You delete certain things from your diet. So you're not fasting, but for 40 days you don't eat meat, you don't eat sweets, you don't have coffee, you don't. But there is the Muslim fasting is completely different because for however many hours from sunrise to sunset, you do not put anything through your mouth. In fact, if you want to be very strict, even saliva, you're not supposed to kind of swallow. I mean, that is practically impossible. But, it is taken to a sort of different level, let's say.
Well, if we dig back deeper, though, one of the things I'd read from an American scholar about this, an anthropological professor, was fundamentally fasting was a method of control for the clergy. So it was also about controlling, their congregation. So there's a piece of it that's not necessarily just connected to God or gods, but also about convening community and controlling community. Would you? Well,
I think religion, I'm an atheist, but religion is a form of control. The Pope, the Catholic Church controls their faithful with all the sort of tenets and so, yeah, I don't know. Ramadan is not, for me, I don't see Ramadan as a form of control rather than a form of purification. For, even Muslims who are not particularly religious fast during Ramadan and do charity, because there are families who cook for hundreds of people and distribute the food every day of Ramadan. Obviously they're rich. The sheikhs in the Gulf, they pay catering kitchens to produce like 3,000, 5,000 meal daily to send to the mosque for those who do not have or who want to eat communally, because you have a lot of workers who don't have their family with them. And they all go to the mosque just before sunset and they sit around, next to each other and they eat these meals that are given free.
And what else is prohibited during this fasting time?
Sex? No, I don't know. I think anything that brings you excessive joy or is a kind of sensual pleasure, you're supposed to kind of purify yourself. So, you don't smoke. If you want to be very religious, you cut out cigarettes. You don't drink. Well, they don't drink anyway, but for those who do drink, you don't. I think in some cases people refrain from sex as well because it's the month where they're getting closer to God and they issue like earthly pleasures. But this does not apply to the food, because as soon as they break the fast, they're feasting. They're not just eating. The night is spent joyfully with family and friends and sweets and big dishes, tables full of different foods. It's a wonderful, it's much more interesting than Lent because there is this kind of contrast between the austerity of the day and the joyfulness of and abundancy of the night.
The Christians have Mardi Gras though, which is super fun.
Yeah, but it's one day.
and you have Eid at the end. So tell me about that. Actually, Amira, can you tell me about Eid at the end, the celebration at the end of Ramadan?
Yeah, like in Indonesia, we would usually visit all of our family. So it's a big thing. Everyone would have their holiday, either travel by land or by air, and then we would always everyone meet in the family. And for me, we also had this tradition. I would cook with my family, with my grandparents. We would make this like dishes and like small sweets, and we would bring it to the neighbors as well. And I think for me, it's about cooking and spending time with family and just meeting everyone else after a long time of like 1 year of being somewhere else. We would always meet at the end of Ramadan during the Eid and see everyone and eat. And I think it's just a big celebration and it's a big tradition I always look out for. And for me, we always got money at the end.
Oh, nice.
For the children, we always get money from the adults, and they would give us each of us something to spend for the year. And there was always something me and my sister look out to, because we would at the end count how much money we get, and so it's a big thing that we always look forward to.
And so Indonesia, it's what is it? 3 days?
I think it's 3 days as well.
Yeah, and so does the whole country shut down?
They don't shut down, but I think depends on where you are. I think this is also a big thing with Indonesia, because in some part, I think more the eastern part is very Christian, very Catholic at the same time. And like for example, in Bali, it's very Hinduist, and so it really depends on where you are. And they do a lot of things shut down, I think, because they do spend time with their family. And before that, I think major cities get very crowded at the end because everyone would go out of the major cities, because people would move before to major cities to work and for jobs and everything. And so it's a lot of things shut down for sure.
Nice. And Senya, how is it for you with the celebration, especially at the end? Obviously in Indonesia, it's great because you're going to get lots of money and very cool experience with your family. But I'm interested in your experience as an expat, because your family comes to Canada alone. How do you create those family rituals and traditions?
You keep the same ones that you had back home, essentially. So, the men always wake up in the morning and get dressed up. I love seeing my dad in his little suit, not usually a tie, but, he would make an effort. Mom would lay out the clothes the night before. The kids dress up, you put your jewelry on. Like I'm wearing my grandma's ring, which I never wear, just thinking about these things, right? So these traditions you kind of keep. And then the men go to the mosque to pray. So mostly men, sometimes it's women as well, although sometimes it's divided. In Bosnia, there's space for both, but it varies. So after that prayer, the kids who go to pray run around wild because they know they're getting money. So that's very similar to Asia. Definitely not a materialistic thing. You wouldn't be doing what a lot of kind of the Western society does by flooding your children during Christmas with things that are, to me, ludicrous. But, for a different reason, I also think it's beautiful. I'm just not used to I wasn't raised that way. So that happens. And then when you go home for this lunch, ruchak, it's the woman mostly, sometimes men, depending if they like to cook, everyone's welcome in the kitchen, but mostly women. You prepare for 2-3 days before, right? So you have first you make your sweets because they're good when they soak, right? And then you have your other things. And then the morning off, Mom and I would wake up and make the things that need to be fresh. And then the lamb is marinated, and then you have a certain time during prayer when the lamb goes in. So all these things are timed quite nicely. And usually our tradition is that we always go to the eldest family's home first, whether it's grandma or oldest aunt, or sort of the nuclear woman of the family, I suppose. So that we maintain as much as we can. It gets harder and harder. Now the visits are not maybe so often Thursday, but we do celebrate for 3 days, right? So then you kind of go and you visit friends, and there are certain things that you bring to the home, and it's wonderful. I think Eid is a beautiful time.
So I just want to mention that Christina Brun in the chat says her kids always look forward to, and there's a name for it, Id money, essentially, when they were little, and they would calculate how much they would give their children by multiplying their age by 10. So there's the rule.
Also, Rosie's questions, talking how she's kind of been in different places, but also that share. So there's this generosity, and that really is practice. I think that's really across, even in Bosnia, and it's something that we've kind of maintained here. We call it sevap, right? So it's like good karma. We have karma and we have dharma. If you don't practice the two, what's the point?
Very nice. Yeah, just to reiterate that, Rosie had a comment and a question that I'm going to throw at you, Anissa, because you've actually experienced the Muslim culture in a variety of different nations, a variety of different continents. But she asks, living outside of your country of origin, have you felt a difference in culture in relation to sharing food with friends, family, strangers? She's from the UK, but has spent time in Jordan and Morocco during Ramadan. Always found the generosity towards strangers astounding in both places.
Well, I mean, let's say Muslim hospitality, because I'm like generalizing here, but I found in Pakistan people were just as hospitable as in Lebanon, incredible. So they open their homes to you even if they don't know you. Wonderful food, great hospitality. I'm actually having lived in the UK for 47 years or even more, have become much less hospitable when people visit me. I sometimes don't even offer them coffee. And if my mother saw me like not offering anything to a visitor, she would be horrified. It's just a tradition. It's to do with religion, but it's also to do with culture. I mean, the Middle East, but it is the Prophet, kind of says that hospitality is part of, being a good Muslim. I can't remember the quote now, but I put it in my book. It is an essential, honoring guests is an essential part of practicing the religion and coming from those cultures.
Well, so inviting a stranger into your home, and what I've understood too, even if it's an enemy, to feed them is considered a must.
Absolutely.
But then also the idea that you're sharing and you're creating that community then builds trust in each other as neighbors, I think.
Well, I mean, you can feed them and then kill them after. It is known to have happened.
Yes, I know. But hopefully not. We're coming to the end of our conversation, and I really, really thank you guys for joining tonight. It's been a really interesting conversation. If there's any more questions, if you can put them in the chat. Amira, I just want to ask you, because you are studying in Berlin, anything you miss about home?
Yes, I mean, for sure the food. That's definitely a big thing. And I really want to go back, but also with COVID right now, everything is a little bit different. Also, I think the same as what you mentioned in Canada, we also have this restriction from the government that you have to go to hotels, and it's also extremely expensive. And so the food is definitely something I'm missing so much. And with the Ramadan, I think the festive of it, the celebration, with me being students here with my friends in Berlin, we would always meet up at the end. I think Ramadan is now, Eid especially, is just about meeting up with everyone again, eat food from Indonesia, having this connection again. And so those things are definitely something I'm missing, just this festiveness of Ramadan.
And just a curiosity, because I mean, Indonesian food isn't so prevalent here. Do you find it hard to find those things that you crave that are attached to this holiday in Berlin?
In Berlin, there are actually a couple of Indonesian restaurants that are quite good, but they're of course not as various as there are in Indonesia. And so my friends and I would sometimes cook together, we would bring food together, and then we would spend time together. And Indonesian food is not as hard as to find, but there are not that many.
And Senya, one last thought from you. What foods do you miss most from home?
Quite frankly, the lamb. It's such a different taste, and it's so tender, and it's so juicy, and it just smells so sweet. I mean, also, our terroir is totally different in Bosnia. I grew up in the mountains and rivers, so I miss that. And I miss the ezan, the prayer, the call to prayer. Because we have a lot of valleys, so there's a lot of echoes and a lot of very old mosques. And sometimes my father would go to certain villages to listen to the ezan, knowing when, it would be called. and he would get emotional. And until this day, if we find a good one, I'll share it to him, and tears flood. So the little things.
Amazing. And Anissa, you're lucky enough to live in Sicily, which even though it's not a Muslim country and it's not in the Middle East, the food has been impacted. So you often say that you get the flavors of your home from there.
I do. Not quite the same, but I mean, I travel a lot, well, pre-COVID, and I bring back ingredients with me. So my kitchen is stocked with practically everything I need. And fresh produce in Sicily, as you know, is incredible. And actually, the lamb in Sicily is delicious as well. As good as, unfortunately, it's not the same in America, but basically because they let them grow too big. I don't know about Canada, but it's mutton rather than, lamb.
It's the same. It's interesting. We're not, North Americans are not a lamb eating culture. Even cheese is not something that's widely accepted, especially from a psychological level. We just weren't shepherds, period. And there's a reason why people in the Middle East, and especially from the Muslim countries, kept those animals. They were their grazers. They were their companions. They were their, they took care of them, and they would eat them as they needed them, right?
Exactly.
So, well, again, thank you all for joining me tonight. This is such an enlivening conversation, and I hope that everyone got a little bit out of it. In terms of something that they didn't know. I know when I was reading the comments, it seems like a lot of people have had experience with Ramadan, so I'm glad that you joined us as well. I think it's interesting that as Terroir, we're able to shine a light on some of these concepts and religious practices that aren't necessarily always talked about. And again, talking about that interconnectivity of culture is so important for us. I just put a link in the chat in the stage, and I wanted to announce that our next big Terroir event, which is going to be a virtual day-long symposium, we're going to highlight Turkey. And we're going to talk about Istanbul and the Aegean and the interconnectedness that it has with other Mediterranean countries, both through food and culture. So I'm hoping that you'll all be able to join for that. Again, the link's there, but I'll email you out and give you a heads up on that as well. And ladies, always a pleasure. You have such interesting stories to share. And I hope we'll be able to have these conversations again.
Thank you, Eileen.
Thank you so much.
All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.